In this video, we're continuing on taking a look at how to use software tools to build histograms. In an earlier video, we used Microsoft Excel's native histogram feature. Now what I'd like to do is use the histogram feature in the add-in tool called QI macros. In the learning objectives for this video, we'll build a histogram using QI macros. Then we'll modify the default view of the histogram by working with something that QI macros creates called a hist data worksheet tab. And as a last thing, we'll take a look at changing the source data in the chart for resizing purposes. Let's go take a look at building histograms using QI macros. All right, so I've loaded one of the course demo data files. This is pizza delivery support data. And I've got QI macros installed on this computer. I can tell because in your menu choices, you'll get a new menu item called QI macros. Here's how we create a histogram using QI macros. I've got the pizza fulfillment data, and I'm interested in creating a histogram of total lead time. I'm going to highlight the data that I want to have histogrammed. After the data has been highlighted, I'm going to go up to the QI macros menu, and I'm going to choose the histograms and capabilities submenu. There are a whole bunch of options in here. The histogram that you will most frequently choose is histogram including CP, CPK, process capability metrics for normally distributed data. There are other histogram options. The second most frequent choice I have is if I just want to create a simple frequency histogram. But the histogram with CP, CPK is going to allow us to include specification limits. It's also going to give us all of the special descriptive statistics that we might want in a process improvement analysis. So let's choose that one. The first dialog box that you'll get is asking whether or not the data that you've selected is is clumped into subgroups. For example, say you were pulling multiple measurements off of an assembly line for the diameter of golf balls, and you had, say, 3 columns of measurement data. In that situation, we'd specify that we'd have a subgroup size of 3. In most cases, if you're highlighting a single column of data, the subgroup size is going to be the default 1. And QI macros does a pretty good job of guessing how many subgroups you've got highlighted in your data. In this case, I'm just going to choose the default 1, just one subgroup. The next dialog box that pops up is asking whether or not there is a specification limit that should be included in the histogram. And you'll notice what it says. If there is no specification limit, don't press 0. Instead, click on Cancel. In the pizza case, we knew that there was an upper specification limit at 30 minutes. Anything beyond 30 minutes was a failed delivery, and the pizza was given away for free. So we set the upper spec to 30. In this situation. It then asks in the next dialog box if you've got a lower specification limit. This is pretty frequent in manufacturing environments to have both an upper and a lower specification limit. In the pizza case, there is no penalty if it arrives quicker, so there is no lower spec limit. Remember, if there is no lower specification limit, don't choose 0, instead click Cancel. So that's what I'm going to do. By default, the QI macros histogram wizard will take a look at the number of data points that you've highlighted and use the number of bins rule of thumb calculation to determine the number of bars that you'll see in your histogram. In the workbook, I've got a little worksheet that you can walk through to calculate this manually, but the software does it for you. And right now, the default number of bars is set to 6. If I wanted to change that, if I wanted to include more bars, I just change that number. And frequently what I'll do is I'll create a histogram with default settings, and if I want more or less bars, I'll just rerun the histogram macro and choose a different value. Later, we'll also take a look at ways to manually change the number of bars. So the default of 6, I'm going to go with this first time and see how it looks. And there you have it. You've got a histogram created. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see some of the information that was created automatically. So you'll notice what we've got here. Let me just walk you through a couple of things. All of our descriptive statistics for central tendency are calculated and displayed on the chart, mean, median, and mode. We've got also descriptive statistics about variation included in here, standard deviation, min, max. There are a variety of other descriptive statistics that, depending upon where you are in the data analysis course, we may or may not have covered process performance capability metrics like CP and CPK. And if that information is not familiar for you yet, don't worry about it. We'll cover it later. CP and CPK, CP, these CP metrics here are starred because there is no lower specification limit. We only had an upper spec. But regardless, we've got a variety of descriptive statistics right here. One of the ones I really like is the percent defects, or how many of the data points are outside of the specification limit. This blue bar right here, let me see if I can get it highlighted. There we go. This blue line is a representation of what this curve would look like if it were a true normal curve distribution. So you can use that to help with, sometimes when we're testing for anomaly, we want to compare our data's histogram to a perfect normal distribution, and this gives us that ability. I find that this extra line sometimes clutters up the chart a little bit more than what's needed, so I'll frequently highlight it and just press delete to get rid of it. And that's a really good point here. When a histogram is created using QI macros, it doesn't ever modify the actual data file. It instead creates a separate worksheet tab to put the chart in, so you can go in and modify it and it doesn't mess with the original data. I love how the histogram feature in QI macros includes a specification limit. That's what this red line is right here. It's I think, a little bit more robust way to create histograms for process improvement work. But there are some issues. One of the issues is, and I'm going to zoom in, the number, the starting point for the number of bins. We can't ever have a pizza delivered in under 0 minutes, but yet the x-axis begins at negative 5.4. That's kind of irritating. I'd like to be able to change that. And these bin sizes right now, from 2.8 to 11, from 11 to 19.2, they're not very business friendly. I'd like to see the bin sizes be more like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or at least whole numbers, not fractions of numbers. So there's some things that I'd like to clean up in here. And so to do that, what we'll do is we'll take a look at modifying this histogram, not modifying the data, but just modifying the view that the histogram presents to us by looking at the data tab right here. Depending on the version of QI macros you have, it's sometimes called the Hist Data tab. In other cases, it's just called the Data tab. But what it does is it takes a copy of the original data, and then it places that data in its own data tab, and then begins to perform the calculations. There are a few fields in this pretty complex data tab that are important for us if we want to do modification. And so I'm going to zoom in and take a look at one of those. One of the most frequently changed values in the data tab is the beginning point here. And I'm not going to have it start at negative 5.0. I'm going to have it start at 0. So I'll just go in and I change that to 0. By doing that, let's take a look at what the histogram now looks like. Now we've got the x-axis at an appropriate starting point, and maybe you might want to start the x-axis maybe not at 0, maybe you want to start it at 10-minute mark or wherever, but it's really easy to make that change. The next thing that I want to do is take a look at these bin sizes. Looks like we've got bin sizes of 8.2. I'd like to change that to make it a little bit more business friendly. So I'll go back to the data tab, and where I make that change is in the class width field setting. I'm going to change from 8.2 to, let's go with 10 minutes. And now let's take a look at what happens to our histogram. And now we've got bins that are a little bit more business friendly. There are some problems, though, when you do this type of modification. In particular, let me zoom out. In particular, notice that when we were making changes to the way that the histogram looked, remember we haven't actually modified any of the data points. We're just taking and tweaking the visual look of the histogram. When we made those changes by modifying this data tab, one of the limitations that I see in QI macros, and technically it's an Excel limitation, but Excel and QI macros, is that after these static objects like arrows, like your spec limit arrows, are drawn in a chart, they don't dynamically move. There are other elements like the bar sizes that do dynamically move. You change them in the data tab and it shows up different on the chart. But these objects like an arrow, they don't dynamically move. And so when we change the x-axis origination at 0 and the bin sizes to 10 minutes, we're going to need to manually move the upper specification limit to its appropriate value of 30 minutes. So I'm going to take this line and I'm just going to move it over here to 30. Remember, I haven't modified the data at all. This information is still valid, but because the arrow object does not dynamically move when you change a different value in a different worksheet, we have to do this manually. Same thing over here. This arrow that specifies the mean at 40, I'm going to take it and move it over to 40, like so. So be aware of that. If you ever go into this data tab, make any sort of changes, you'll probably have to go back and move your spec and mean static arrow object. Let's now take a look at changing the bars, but let's make the bars a little bit smaller. We had 10-minute increments before. Let's now change them to 5-minute increments. It's a little, I guess what I'd like to call, I like the histogram to be a little bit more granular in the view. So let's give that a shot. I'll go back to the data tab. And in this situation, the class width, I'll change from 10 to 5. And now let's take a look and see what happens to our histogram. We've now got our bins at a nice 5, 10, 15-minute increments. We're going to have to move again because we made changes to the scale. We're going to have to manually move these arrows. But I got a bigger issue right now. The rest of the histogram over here has been cut off. We've run out of space on our chart. In part 2 of this video, we'll take a look at how to resolve this dilemma of space and availability for our histogram chart. But to trying to keep these videos 15 minutes or less, I'm going to have to pause here and we'll solve this problem in part 2. See you soon.